The last box felt heavier than all the others combined. It wasn't the weight of the books inside, mostly my old engineering textbooks that I couldn't bring myself to throw away, but the weight of finality. I set it down on the warped floorboards of the living room, the thud echoing through the cavernous, empty space. Dust motes danced in the thick shafts of late afternoon sunlight slanting through the tall, grimy windows. From the back of the house, I could hear my son, Sean, already clattering around, his boots loud against the cypress wood. "Dad, you gotta see this porch," he yelled, his voice filled with the kind of unbridled enthusiasm only a 17-year-old can muster. I walked through the dining room, my hand trailing along the peeling floral wallpaper. The house was a relic, a grand old dame of a plantation home left to sag on her pilings at the edge of the Louisiana bayou. It was majestic in its decay, a 2-story monument to a bygone era, complete with a wraparound veranda that was probably magnificent a century ago. Now, it was just big. And ours. After Sarah passed, the silence in our Austin suburb became a physical presence, a suffocating blanket. I needed a change, a project. Sean needed a new world to explore. This house, bought for a song at a foreclosure auction, was supposed to give us both. I stepped out onto the veranda, and the world changed. The air grew heavy, thick with a humidity that felt like you could drink it. A wall of green, impossibly lush and dense, rose up from the edge of a waterway so dark and still it looked like polished obsidian. Cypress trees, draped in ghostly shrouds of Spanish moss, stood like ancient sentinels in the murky water. The steady, high-pitched drone of cicadas was an omnipresent hum, the heartbeat of the swamp. Sean was leaning against a railing that looked suspiciously unsteady. "Look at that," he breathed, sweeping his arm towards the bayou. "No light pollution, no neighbors. It's perfect." He was already mentally filming the intro to his next vlog post. His channel, Carter's Critters, was his passion, a digital chronicle of his explorations into the wild. He saw this place not as a rundown money pit, but as a sprawling, untamed studio. "It's something all right," I said, testing a floorboard with my foot. "First order of business is to make sure this whole porch doesn't collapse into the drink." The first few days fell into a rhythm of hard, satisfying labor. We tore out rotten wood, patched the roof, and scrubbed away decades of grime. Sean attacked his work with surprising vigor, but every afternoon, like clockwork, he'd grab his camera and disappear into the tree line, returning hours later, muddy and grinning, with footage of exotic-looking birds, fat bullfrogs, and the occasional water snake. We were building a new life, board by board, nail by nail. The ghosts of Austin felt 1,000,000 miles away. The first sign that something was wrong came on our 4th night. We were sitting on the porch nursing cold beers, a root beer for Sean, and listening to the symphony of the swamp. The frogs and insects kept a steady rhythm, a familiar, comforting sound. Then, a new sound cut through the chorus. It was a howl. It started low, a guttural lament that seemed to rise from the very mud of the bayou, then climbed into a high, piercing cry that vibrated in my chest. It was long, drawn out, and filled with a kind of ancient sorrow that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a coyote, and it wasn't any dog I'd ever heard. It sounded too big, too powerful, and too smart. There was a chilling intelligence to it, a quality that suggested it wasn't just an animal making a noise. It was a creature communicating something. "Whoa," Sean whispered, his eyes wide. What was that? My practical engineer's mind scrambled for an explanation. Some kind of local wildlife. Maybe a big feral dog or a red wolf. but the words sounded hollow even to me. The howl echoed once more, closer this time, before the swamp fell into a sudden, unnerving silence. The frogs and crickets had gone quiet, as if holding their collective breath. We didn't talk about it again that night, but the quiet that followed was more unsettling than the howl itself. I locked the doors, something I hadn't bothered to do since we'd arrived, and found myself sleeping lightly, my ears straining against the silence. The next morning, the world seemed normal again. The sun was bright, the cicadas were buzzing, and the memory of the howl felt like a half-remembered dream. Sean was already up and out, camera in hand, down by the water's edge. "Dad, get down here, now!" I grabbed my boots and hurried down the gentle slope of the backyard to where he was crouched near a muddy patch of bank. He was pointing at the ground, his face a mixture of awe and fear. There, pressed deep into the dark, wet earth, was a set of tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my hand. The basic shape was canine, like a wolf's, with 4 distinct pads and the deep impression of claws. But there were 2 things horribly wrong. First, the prints were arranged in a clear bipedal pattern, 1 foot in front of the other, not the 4-legged gait of an animal. The stride between them was immense, at least 6 feet. Second, the depth of the impression spoke of an incredible weight, far more than any wolf or dog. It was as if a giant 2-legged wolf had walked right past our house in the dead of night. I stared at the tracks, my logical mind struggling to process what I was seeing. A bear? No, the print was all wrong. A prank? Who would come all the way out here to pull a prank on us? Sean was already filming, his voice a hushed, excited whisper. "These are incredible. The substrate is alluvial silt, so the impression is perfect. Look at the depth here. This thing is heavy. Really heavy." I looked up from the impossible footprints, my gaze sweeping across the dark, unmoving water and the dense, silent curtain of the cypress forest beyond. For the first time since we'd arrived, I didn't feel like we had found a quiet refuge. I felt like we had trespassed. We were strangers here, and I had the sudden, chilling certainty that we were being watched. And whatever was watching us had just left its calling card. The discovery of the tracks lit a fire in Sean. My own reaction was to double-check the locks and calculate the cost of motion sensor floodlights, but my son saw it as the opening chapter of an incredible mystery. The strangeness of this place was a feature, not a bug. His Carter's Critters channel was about to get a serious upgrade from bullfrogs and herons. He found the old canoe in the back of a dilapidated shed behind the house. It was a weather-beaten fiberglass vessel, covered in grime and old leaves, but structurally sound. After an hour of scrubbing and patching a small crack with a repair kit from my toolbox, it was seaworthy. Or at least, bayou-worthy. "Just be careful, Sean," I said, standing on our rickety little dock as he prepared to launch. "Stay where you can see the house." "I will," he said, his focus already on mounting his waterproof camera to the bow. "I just want to get some shots of the cypress knees and the waterfowl back in that channel. It's a whole different ecosystem in there." I watched him paddle away, his red canoe a stark splash of color against the murky greens and browns of the swamp. He disappeared into a narrow channel choked with water hyacinths, the ancient cypress trees swallowing him whole. An uneasy quiet settled over the property. With Sean gone, the drone of the insects and the oppressive humidity seemed to intensify. I tried to busy myself with repairing a window frame on the 2nd floor, but my eyes kept drifting back to the bayou, searching for a flash of red among the trees. He was gone for 3 hours. Long enough for me to imagine a dozen different scenarios, each worse than the last. The canoe tipping, a run-in with an alligator, getting lost in the labyrinthine waterways. By the time I saw him paddling back, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, I was about to get in the truck and find the nearest sheriff's office. "Anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I helped him pull the canoe onto the bank. "So much," he said, his face flushed with excitement. "It's unbelievable back there, Dad. Like stepping into another time. Everything is so quiet and watchful." He paused, pulling the camera from its mount. It was weird, though. I kept feeling like I wasn't alone. You know that feeling? The one you get on your neck. "It's a big swamp, Sean. Probably just a deer or something watching you go by." "Yeah, probably," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. That evening, he sat hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, editing the day's footage. I was trying to decipher the house's ancient fuse box when he called me over. "Check this out," he said, pointing to the screen. He played a clip. A slow, smooth pan across a thicket of cypress trees. The water was like glass, reflecting the gnarled branches and hanging moss perfectly. It was beautiful and eerie. "I don't see anything," I said. "Watch the background," he insisted. "Right there." He slowed the video down, advancing it frame by frame. And then I saw it. For a split second, maybe 4 or 5 frames, a shape moved between 2 massive cypress trunks in the deep background. It wasn't a glitch or a trick of the light. It was dark, bulky, and upright. It moved with a fluid, powerful speed that was utterly unnatural for the terrain. One moment it was there, a solid, hulking silhouette, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the ancient forest. It was too far away to make out any details, but its size was immense. We watched it again and again. The logical part of my brain tried to offer explanations. A black bear standing up, a large boar, another person. None of them fit. The speed, the sheer mass of it. It was wrong. "What do you think that is?" Sean whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. "I don't know," I admitted, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The howl, the tracks, and now this. These weren't isolated incidents. They were data points in a terrifying equation I couldn't solve. That night, the fear became tangible. We were both asleep when a loud, scraping sound from the veranda jolted me awake. It was followed by a heavy thump, 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 footsteps. But they were wrong. They were heavy, ponderous, the sound of something with immense weight moving slowly across the wooden planks of our porch. It wasn't the light-footed tread of a raccoon or an opossum. This was something that shook the floorboards. I grabbed the heavy-duty mag light I kept by the bed and crept out of my room. Sean was standing in the hallway, his face pale in the moonlight slanting through the landing window. He held a baseball bat, his knuckles white. We looked at each other, a silent question passing between us. Then came the sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, guttural growl rumbled from just outside the front door. It was a deep, chesty sound filled with a predatory rage that was terrifyingly close. It was the sound a grizzly bear might make if it learned how to hate. The growl escalated into a full-blown roar, a blast of sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very frame of the house. It was a declaration, a warning, a promise of violence. We stood frozen in the hallway, hearts pounding for what felt like an eternity. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. There were no more footsteps, no more growls, just the familiar chorus of the swamp, which had tentatively started up again, as if nothing had happened. After 10 minutes of nerve-shredding silence, I finally worked up the courage to move. I crept to the living room window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The moon was bright, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. The porch was empty. Whatever had been there was gone. I waited until the first gray light of dawn before I dared to unlock the front door. Sean was right behind me, his baseball bat still held at the ready. We stepped out onto the veranda, the morning air cool and damp. There was no sign of anything amiss at first. Then Sean pointed. "Dad, look." He was pointing at the thick cypress railing near the front steps. I walked over and saw what he was looking at. 5 deep grooves, each as thick as my finger, were gouged into the solid wood. They ran for about 2 feet, splintering the aged timber as if it were balsa wood. They weren't made by tools. They were claw marks, deep, powerful, and spaced far apart. Whatever had been on our porch last night had left another message, one that was impossible to misinterpret. "You are not welcome here." The claw marks on the veranda were a turning point. Logic could no longer explain away what was happening. You can rationalize a strange sound or an odd footprint, but deep gouges in solid wood from a creature that walks on 2 legs and roars like a demon? My engineering brain, which craved order and reason, was coming up empty. I needed supplies, but more than that, I needed a dose of normalcy, a connection to the outside world. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't saturated with the oppressive silence of the bayou. "I'm heading into town for groceries," I told Sean, who was meticulously photographing the claw marks from every conceivable angle. "You stay here, keep the doors locked, and don't go wandering off." He nodded, not looking up from his camera. "Get some more beef jerky and batteries." The drive to the nearest town, a sleepy collection of buildings called Moreauville, took a half-hour along a 2-lane blacktop that cut a straight line through miles of swamp and sugarcane fields. The town itself wasn't much. A post office, a general store, a gas station, and a squat windowless building with a faded neon sign that flickered Billy Bob's. On a whim, after loading the truck with groceries, I pulled into the gravel lot in front of the bar. Maybe a cold beer and some local conversation would ground me. The inside of Billy Bob's was dark and cool, a welcome escape from the oppressive Louisiana heat. The air smelled of stale beer, fried catfish, and something vaguely like regret. A couple of old-timers sat at a corner table nursing their drinks in comfortable silence. The only other person was the bartender, a big man with a graying beard and a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak. He polished a glass with a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just a beer, whatever's on tap." He drew a draft and set the frosty mug in front of me. "You're new around here. Just passing through?" "Moved in," I said, taking a long swallow of the cold beer. "Bought the old Devereaux place out on Bayou Teche." The bartender stopped polishing the glass. His eyes, small and dark, seemed to assess me. "The old plantation house? On the stilts? Ain't nobody lived out there in 20 years. "My son and I are fixing it up," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's quiet." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Quiet ain't always the same as peaceful, my friend." I decided to test the waters. It's definitely got its own character. We've heard some strange things at night. Howls. And we found some big tracks down by the water. The friendly demeanor vanished from the bartender's face. He put the glass down and leaned forward on his thick arms, his voice dropping. "Let me give you some advice, free of charge. The swamp's got its own ways, its own rules. Some things are best left alone. You hear a sound you don't recognize, you go inside and lock your door. You see something you can't explain, you look the other way. What kind of things? I pressed. He glanced around the empty bar before leaning closer. Folks around here, they got stories. Stories about the Rougarou. He said the name with a kind of weary reverence. Loup-garou, the French called it. A man who carries a curse, changes with the moon, becomes a beast, half man, half wolf. He shook his head slowly. He's been in that bayou longer than this town's been here. It's his land, and he don't like trespassers. My skeptical mind wanted to dismiss it as a local boogeyman story, a folktale told to scare kids and tourists. But the memory of that intelligent, furious howl and the bipedal wolf tracks was too fresh, too real. So he's dangerous? I asked. Before the bartender could answer, a raspy voice cut in from the corner table. He ain't the one you ought to be worried about. I turned. One of the old-timers had gotten up and was walking toward the bar. He was wiry and thin, his face a road map of wrinkles under a stained baseball cap. He moved with the stiff grace of a man who had spent his life outdoors. He nodded to the bartender, who stepped back as if ceding the floor. That Rougarou, the old man said, his voice a dry whisper. He's a territorial beast, yeah. He'll make a lot of noise, tear things up. He's sending you a message letting you know you're on his turf. He wants you gone, sure. But he's just one. The old hunter leaned against the bar, his faded blue eyes locking onto mine. It's the others you gotta fear. The Rougarou is the devil, you know. The ones that live under the Snake's Ridge. They're the devil you don't. Snake's Ridge? I asked, the name sounding vaguely familiar from looking at maps of the area. An old karst ridge, about 3 miles up the bayou from your place, full of sinkholes and caves that flood with the tides. That's their home. He lowered his voice even further, forcing me to lean in to hear him. The Grunch. The name was absurd, almost childish. But the way he said it, with a deep, primal fear in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. We call them swamp orphans, he continued, his whisper barely audible over the hum of the beer cooler. Things that live in the dark and the wet. They ain't like the Rougarou. He's one. They are many. He held up a shaky hand, fingers splayed. They hunt in packs. Smart. Vicious. They've been fighting the Rougarou for that stretch of swamp for longer than any of us have been alive. A war that never ends. He took a step back, his story finished. He picked up his beer from his table and drained it in one go. Your house, he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. That old Devereaux place, it's built right on the border. The no man's land between them. For 20 years, that house stood empty, and they kept their distance, respected the line. But now you're there. You and your boy. You're a new piece on the board. He walked towards the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with a grim certainty. The Rougarou is screaming at you to leave his front yard. But you better hope to God you never meet the things that are coming from his backyard. 'Cause they don't scream. They just feed. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the blinding sunlight, leaving me alone in the cool, dark bar with the silent bartender and the terrifying weight of his words. The old hunter's words haunted the drive back to the house. The Grunch. Swamp orphans. It sounded like a campfire story, the kind of local legend designed to keep outsiders from poking around where they don't belong. But his fear had been genuine, a deep-seated dread that couldn't be faked. When I got home and relayed the conversation to Sean, I expected him to be spooked. I was wrong. His eyes lit up with the fervent glow of an explorer who's just been handed a treasure map. "Snake Ridge," he said, already pulling up satellite images on his laptop. He said it's a karst ridge? That's unusual for this part of Louisiana. Mostly it's just alluvial plains and wetlands. "Sean, the man was warning us. He was telling us to stay away." "He was giving us a location, Dad," Sean countered, zooming in on a topographical overlay. "Look, here's our property, and if you follow the bayou about 3 miles northeast, there it is. A distinct elevation. It's not high, maybe 40 or 50 feet, but it's there. Snake Ridge." I spent the rest of the day trying to talk him out of it, my arguments fueled by a growing unease. I talked about safety, about unknown terrain, about respecting the warnings of people who've lived here their whole lives. But trying to argue a 17-year-old out of a great adventure is like trying to argue with the tide. His curiosity was a force of nature, and it had been ignited by the hunter's tale. The next morning, I woke up to a note on the kitchen counter. "Dad, just gone to get some sunrise shots. Be back in a couple of hours." Sean, I knew instantly where he'd gone. A cold dread washed over me. I grabbed my keys, ready to drive out and search for him, but I didn't even know which direction to take. The ridge was deep in the swamp, accessible only by water. He'd taken the canoe. There was nothing I could do but wait, pacing the length of the veranda, my eyes scanning the impassive surface of the bayou. From Sean's perspective, as he told me later with a breathless, terrified excitement, the journey itself was unnerving. The bayou was different that morning. The usual chorus of birds was absent. An unnatural stillness lay over the water as he paddled deeper into the maze of channels, leaving the familiar sight of our house behind. He navigated using the GPS on his phone, the little blue dot tracing a path into the uncharted green. After an hour of paddling, the landscape began to change. The ground sloped upwards, and the cypress and tupelo trees gave way to oak and hickory. He'd reached the base of Snake Ridge. He pulled the canoe onto a muddy bank and stepped onto solid, rocky ground for the first time since we'd arrived. The air here was different, heavier. It carried a foul smell, a wet, cloying odor of stagnant water, decay, and something else. Something musky and carnivorous. The drone of insects was quieter here, muffled by the dense canopy and the strange topography. He followed the base of the ridge, his camera held ready, though he later confessed he was too on edge to film much. He found the caves after about 15 minutes of hiking. They weren't grand, yawning caverns, but a series of jagged fissures and dark openings at the base of the limestone ridge, half hidden by tangled roots and thick undergrowth. Most were partially submerged, the black, still water of the bayou extending deep into the rock. It looked like the ridge was honeycombed with a network of flooded tunnels. Drawn by a morbid curiosity he couldn't explain, he approached the largest of the openings, a dark maw about 10 feet high and 20 feet wide. The smell was overpowering here. It was the smell of a lair, of a slaughterhouse. He clicked on his headlamp, its powerful beam cutting into the darkness. The light fell upon a gruesome sight just inside the entrance, on a small muddy ledge above the waterline. A pile of bones. They were everywhere. The delicate rib cages of raccoons, the shattered shells of turtles, the skulls of deer and wild boar. They were all clean, stripped of every shred of flesh, many of them cracked open, presumably for the marrow. And scattered amongst the old bleached bones were the fresh remains of a kill. A half-eaten raccoon lay in a pool of drying blood, its body torn apart with a savage, chaotic violence. This wasn't the work of a single clean predator. This was a feeding frenzy. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Sean's excitement. This wasn't a research trip anymore. This was a trespass. The old hunter's words echoed in his head. They hunt in packs. He imagined dozens of things, pale and hungry, emerging from the dark water below him. He was standing in their den. He began backing away slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. That's when he heard it. A sound from deep within the flooded cave. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was a wet, clicking sound. A series of sharp, guttural clicks like stones being knocked together underwater. It was answered by another. From a different direction inside the cave, then another and another, a strange, alien form of communication echoing from the darkness. He didn't wait to hear anymore. He turned and ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, not caring about the noise he was making. He scrambled back to the canoe, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and shoved off from the bank with frantic energy. He paddled with a strength born of pure terror. Not looking back, the image of the bone pile burned into his mind and the chilling clicking sounds echoing in his ears. He didn't slow down until our house came into view, a fragile sanctuary on the edge of a world he never should have entered. When he finally stumbled onto the dock, his face was ashen, his adventurous spirit completely extinguished and replaced by the stark, wide-eyed look of someone who has peered into the abyss and seen something looking back. Sean's terror was contagious. He described the bone-strewn cave entrance and the chorus of subterranean clicks with a frantic low voice. And I felt the cold certainty that the old hunter's stories were not just folklore. We were living in a place governed by ancient predatory rules we were only just beginning to understand. The bravado Sean had was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful fear. He no longer saw the swamp as a grand adventure. He saw it as a threat that surrounded us on all sides. For the rest of the day, a heavy silence hung between us. Every creak of the old house, every splash from the bayou, made us both jump. That night, sleep offered no escape. I was lost in a restless dream, a chaotic jumble of splintering wood and furious roars, when a sound from the real world ripped me back to consciousness. It was a deafening crack, an explosive splintering of wood that sounded like a massive tree had been struck by lightning right outside our house. It was immediately followed by a heavy, wet thud that shook the entire veranda, rattling the windows in their frames. I was out of bed in an instant, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I met Sean in the hallway. He was holding the aluminum baseball bat again, his eyes wide with fear in the dim moonlight. "What was that?" he whispered. "Stay here," I ordered, my voice tight. I grabbed the most powerful flashlight I owned, a heavy metal-cased beam, and crept toward the front door. My hand trembled as I reached for the deadbolt. Peering through the peephole revealed nothing but the familiar, shadow-drenched lawn. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and swung it open, keeping my body behind the heavy wood frame as I shined the beam outside. The scene on the veranda was one of shocking, brutal violence. A huge section of the porch railing, a thick 4x4 cypress beam that I had personally inspected and found to be solid, was shattered. It wasn't rotted or broken, it was snapped in two, the ends jagged with fresh, pale splinters. And lying in the middle of the porch, amidst the debris, was the cause of the thunderous noise. It was a young alligator, maybe 7 or 8 feet long. Or at least it had been. Its back was clearly broken, twisted at an unnatural angle, its powerful body limp and lifeless. Its skull was crushed on one side, a bloody ruin of bone and flesh. But the most horrifying part was how it had gotten there. It hadn't just been killed and left, it had been thrown. Thrown with such incredible, impossible force that it had not only shattered the thick wooden railing, but had also left a deep, concave dent in the siding of the house where it had impacted. I swept the flashlight beam across the lawn, my hand shaking so badly the light danced and jittered. The grass was torn up near the water's edge. A wide, muddy trail showed where the alligator had been dragged from the bayou. And superimposed over that trail were the same massive, bipedal wolf-like tracks we had found before, dug deep into the earth. This was the work of the rougarou. My mind reeled, trying to process the sheer, raw power required to do this. To haul a 200-pound alligator from the water, kill it with what looked like bare hands, and then hurl its carcass like a fast ball through a solid wood railing. This wasn't a random act of animal aggression. I remembered the hunter's words. He's sending you a message. This was that message, written in blood and shattered bone. The howl had been a warning. The claw marks had been a line drawn in the sand. This was an ultimatum. The mangled reptilian corpse lying on our porch was a clear, unambiguous statement. Get out. I pushed Sean back inside and slammed the door, my mind racing. For the first time, I was truly, deeply afraid. Not just startled or unnerved, but gripped by a primal terror that hollowed out my insides. The stories were real. The monster was real, and it was trying to drive us out of its territory. I suddenly felt like an idiot, an arrogant city dweller who had stumbled into a war zone, completely oblivious to the combatants. Dad? Sean's voice was small, stripped of all its teenage confidence. Go to your room. Stay away from the windows, I said, my voice harsher than I intended. I walked numbly to the back of the house, to the old gun cabinet that had come with the property. It was empty, save for a box of cleaning supplies. My own shotgun, an old but reliable Mossberg 12 gauge, was still packed away in a hard case from the move. I found it in a box of sporting goods, the cold, heavy steel a small but significant comfort in my hands. As I sat at the kitchen table, the familiar, methodical process of cleaning and oiling the weapon calming my frayed nerves, the full weight of the hunter's warning crashed down on me. He said the rougarou wasn't the one we should be most afraid of. He said the beast was trying to drive us away. It wasn't just trying to claim its territory. It was trying to get us out of the line of fire. It was trying to save us from whatever was in those caves. The bloody alligator on the porch wasn't just a threat. It was a desperate, final warning from one monster about the existence of others, and we were caught squarely in the middle. The sun would be up in a few hours, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the light would bring no safety. The clock was ticking, and we had just run out of time. The sight of the mutilated alligator in the pale morning light did nothing to lessen its horror. If anything, it was worse. The reality of it was undeniable, a brutal centerpiece on our porch. Flies were already beginning to buzz around the corpse. I knew we couldn't leave it there, but the thought of touching it, of dealing with the physical evidence of such impossible violence, made my stomach churn. Sean, however, seemed to have moved past his initial shock. He was now operating with a kind of feverish, analytical intensity. The fear was still there, visible in the tightness around his eyes and the way he kept glancing towards the dark tree line, but he was channeling it into research. While I wrestled with the gruesome task of dragging the alligator's carcass off the veranda and down to the water's edge, he was inside, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. When I finally came back in, Scrubbing my hands raw at the kitchen sink, he had transformed our dining table into a command center. His laptop was open to a dozen different tabs. Pages of local folklore, cryptozoology forums, and satellite maps were strewn across the table. "I think I've got it, Dad," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I think I know what's happening." I dried my hands and sat down opposite him, the smell of swamp water and blood still clinging to my clothes. "The old guy at the bar was right," Sean began, pointing to his screen. "Everything he said fits. We're dealing with two separate things. Two different species of predator, and we've walked right into the middle of their territory dispute." He pulled up a local parish map and had overlaid it with his own notes. He'd marked our house with a red circle. To the northeast, he had drawn a jagged shape labeled Snake Ridge, the Grunch. To the south and west, in the deeper, more traditional swampland, he'd written Rougarou. Our house was situated almost perfectly on the line between the two. "Look," he said, clicking on a link to a folklore website. "The Rougarou legends are all about a single, powerful creature. A solitary shapeshifter, usually male, that aggressively defends its territory. The stories mention it howling, leaving warnings, and displaying incredible strength. Sound familiar?" I nodded grimly, the image of the alligator flying through the air flashing in my mind. "It's a classic territorial alpha predator," Sean continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Like a grizzly bear or a tiger. Its actions, the howl, the tracks, the claw marks, even that," he gestured vaguely towards the porch, "are all textbook territorial displays. They're meant to intimidate, to scare off intruders. It's not hunting us. It's trying to evict us." He then clicked over to another series of tabs. The pages were filled with obscure, often contradictory accounts of creatures called Grunch or Swamp Devils. Unlike the more well-documented Rougarou, the stories about the Grunch were murkier, describing them as pack animals that lived in caves or underground warrens. They were often depicted as pale, semi-aquatic, and utterly savage. "The legends about the Grunch are different," Sean said, his voice dropping. "They're not about warnings. They're about people and livestock disappearing near certain roads or caves. They're described as relentless pack hunters. What I heard in that cave, Dad," the clicking. It wasn't one creature. It was a lot of them, talking to each other, communicating, coordinating. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine, the terrible thesis of his research finally coming together. "The Rougarou knows they're there. The hunter at the bar said they've been at war for ages. This land, right here where our house is built, is the buffer zone, the front line. For 20 years it was empty, a neutral ground. But now, we're here. We've set up a camp in the middle of no man's land." The pieces clicked into place in my mind, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. We weren't just being harassed by a single monster. We had inadvertently violated a treaty in a war we didn't even know existed. Our presence, our lights, our noise. We had disturbed a fragile, decades-old stalemate. "The Rougarou isn't trying to kill us," I said, thinking aloud, the full weight of our predicament crashing down on me. "It's trying to scare us away for our own good. It knows what happens if the Grunch decide to cross the line and investigate the new neighbors." Sean nodded, his face pale. "Exactly. That alligator wasn't just a threat. It was the Rougarou's last desperate attempt to make us run. It was a warning that something far worse is coming." A profound and chilling silence descended on the room. The familiar everyday sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, were gone. replaced by the crushing weight of our realization. We were utterly, hopelessly trapped. To the west was a monster that wanted us gone. To the east was a pack of them that, according to Sean, didn't issue warnings. We looked at each other across the cluttered table, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What do we do now? Fleeing seemed like the only sane option. Pack a bag, get in the truck, and drive until the Louisiana swamps were just a bad memory in the rearview mirror. But where would we go? We had sunk everything we had into this place. It was supposed to be our new beginning, not our end. Before either of us could voice a plan, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of the sunset was a cruel mockery. As the light faded, the shadows of the cypress trees grew long, stretching like skeletal fingers toward the house. And then, a new sound began. It was not the howl of the rougarou. It came from the direction of Snake Ridge. A high-pitched, chittering series of clicks and shrieks that echoed across the water. It was the sound Sean had heard in the cave, but it wasn't a curious echo now. It was a hunting cry, and it was getting closer. The moment those clicking shrieks echoed across the bayou, the world outside our windows transformed. The familiar ambient symphony of the swamp, the croaking of frogs, the chirping of crickets, the drone of cicadas, died abruptly. It wasn't a gradual fading. It was as if a switch had been thrown, plunging the entire landscape into a profound and terrifying silence. The absence of sound was more alarming than any noise could have been. It was the expectant hush of prey that knows the predators are on the move. We stood frozen in the living room, the last vestiges of daylight bleeding from the sky. My shotgun was leaning against the wall, a cold and inadequate comfort. Sean was by the large picture window, peering out into the deepening twilight. "Dad," he whispered, his voice tight with dread. "You need to see this." I joined him at the window, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. At first I saw nothing but the dark silhouettes of the cypress trees against the inky water. Then I saw the lights. They weren't bright, not like flashlights or lanterns. They were faint, moving pinpricks of pale greenish-white light like foxfire. There were 2 of them at first, then 4, then a dozen, then too many to count. They bobbed and weaved through the trees on the far side of the bayou, moving just above the surface of the water with an unnatural smoothness. They were moving in our direction. "Swamp gas," I muttered, the pathetic attempt at a rational explanation dying on my lips even as I said it. "No," Sean breathed. "It's their eyes." The old hunter said they lived in caves. Bioluminescence. It would make sense for a creature that lives in total darkness. As the glowing eyes drew closer, they resolved into shapes. Pale, stooped figures began to emerge from the black water at the edge of our lawn. They rose from the bayou with a dreadful silence, water streaming from their slick, hairless bodies. They were humanoid in shape, but horribly wrong. Their limbs were too long, their backs hunched. Their skin was the color of dead fish, a sickly, translucent white that seemed to shine faintly in the moonlight. They moved with a loping, primate-like gait, their webbed feet making soft, slapping sounds in the mud. The grunch. They weren't chaotic or frenzied. They moved with a chilling purpose, fanning out in a coordinated semicircle, their glowing eyes all fixed on our house. It was a calculated, military advance. This was not a random encounter. This was an assault. "They're coming for the house," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Sean, get away from the window. Now! Help me with the doors." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. We slammed shut the heavy wooden storm shutters on the downstairs windows, plunging the house into near-total darkness. I slid the deadbolts on the front and back doors, then dragged a heavy oak bookshelf in front of the main entrance. Sean shoved a solid dining table against the kitchen door. The sounds from outside were growing louder now, a cacophony of those sharp, clicking vocalizations, punctuated by guttural hisses and the sound of dozens of bodies moving through the grass. Then came the first impact. A heavy thud against the side of the house, followed by the dry, scraping sound of claws on wood. Another thud, then another. They were testing the walls. Suddenly, a splintering crash came from the living room. One of the creatures had slammed its body against a shuttered window with enough force to crack the thick wood. "They're trying to break in!" Sean yelled, his voice cracking. A new sound started, a rhythmic, insistent scratching at the base of the house. I realized with a fresh wave of horror what they were doing. Our house was built on thick pilings, raising it 10 feet above the damp ground. They weren't just attacking the walls. They were climbing. I ran to the staircase, which had a small window on the landing overlooking the side yard. Peering through a crack in the blinds, I saw them. 3 of the pale creatures were scaling the thick wooden posts, moving with the uncanny agility of spiders. Their long, spidery limbs found purchase on the rough wood, their clawed, webbed hands and feet gripping tight. Their heads swiveled on thin necks, their luminous green eyes scanning the house for any point of entry. The scraping sounds were all around us now, coming from every wall. The house, which had been our fortress, now felt like a wooden box, a trap. We were surrounded, besieged by a tide of silent climbing monsters. A loud shattering sound came from the kitchen. "Dad!" The pantry window. We raced into the kitchen. The window in the small walk-in pantry, one we had overlooked, was broken. A shower of glass littered the floor. A long, pale arm, slick with water and ending in a hand with dirty talon-like claws, was reaching through the empty frame, fumbling for the lock. I didn't think. I raised the Mossberg, aimed, and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The arm disappeared with a wet shriek, and a spray of something dark and thick splattered against the far wall. The shriek was answered by a chorus of enraged clicks and hisses from outside. We had drawn first blood. The siege had begun in earnest. The shotgun blast was a declaration of war. The immediate aftermath was a cacophony of enraged, clicking shrieks from outside. The probing attacks ceased, replaced by a frenzy of directed violence. Bodies slammed against the walls and shutters with renewed, furious force. The sound of splintering wood was everywhere. They knew we were inside, and they knew we were armed. They were no longer testing for weaknesses. They were trying to tear the house down around us. Sean and I were crouched in the central hallway, back to back, the shotgun feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. The pantry was a no-go zone, and the bookshelf I'd moved was rattling against the front door as something battered it from the other side. A face, pale and flat with a lipless mouth and 2 huge, glowing green eyes, appeared for a second at the broken pantry window before I leveled the shotgun and it vanished. They were learning, adapting. "How many rounds do you have?" Sean asked, his voice strained, his eyes darting towards every new sound. "Maybe 20, I replied, the number feeling pitifully small. "It won't be enough." The relentless assault continued for what felt like an eternity. A shutter over the living room window finally gave way with a loud crack, and the sound of breaking glass followed. I fired a shot in that direction and the scrabbling sounds receded, but I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They were a tide of teeth and claws, and our defenses were failing. One of them began hammering at the back door with a rock or a piece of wood, the heavy thuds echoing the frantic beating of my own heart. It was in that moment when the splintering of the back door sounded final, and I was raising the shotgun for a shot I was sure would be my last that the new sound came. It was a howl, but this was not the mournful, warning howl we had heard before. This was a sound of pure, unrestrained fury. It was a roar of rage that ripped through the night, so powerful and savage that it momentarily silenced the chittering of the grunch. The howling roar came again, closer this time, a bellow of primal hatred. Suddenly a heavy, fleshy impact slammed against the side of the house, followed by a high-pitched, gurgling scream unlike the others. Sean and I exchanged a look of stunned disbelief. Through a crack in the boarded-up window, I saw a flash of movement. Something huge and dark moving with impossible speed across our lawn. Then, all hell broke loose in our backyard. The clicks and hisses of the grunch turned from coordinated aggression to panicked alarm. We heard guttural snarls, the sickening sound of flesh tearing, and the wet crunch of bone. It was the sound of a slaughter. I crept to the back door, which now had a sizable hole splintered through its center, and peered out. The moon had risen higher, casting a pale, ghostly light over the scene. Our backyard had become a battlefield. The rougarou was there. It was a nightmare given form. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, a terrifying hybrid of man and wolf. Its body was a mass of thick, corded muscle, covered in shaggy, dark fur. It stood on 2 powerful, digitigrade legs, and its long arms ended in hands tipped with thick, black claws. Its head was wolf-like, with a long snout full of yellowed fangs and eyes that burned with a fierce red light. It was the creature from the tracks, from the canoe footage, from my darkest fears, made real. And it was tearing the grunch apart. It moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. It snatched one of the pale creatures as it tried to flee, lifted it effortlessly into the air, and broke its back over its knee with a sound like a bundle of sticks snapping. It lunged at another, its powerful jaws closing around the creature's head with a sickening crunch. It was a whirlwind of dark fur and righteous violence, a solitary apex predator defending its territory against an invading swarm. Sean was beside me, looking through another crack in the wood. "My God," he whispered. It's fighting them." We watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the brutal battle raged. The grunch, though smaller, were numerous, and fought back with a vicious, desperate energy. They swarmed the huge beast, leaping onto its back, clawing and biting. But the rougarou was a force of nature. It shrugged them off, tearing and slashing, its roars of fury mixing with the death screams of its enemies. The realization dawned on me with a cold, shocking clarity. The old hunter's words again. Enemy of my enemy. The rougarou wasn't protecting us. We were just furniture in the room it was defending. Our house, our presence, had been the catalyst that finally brought this ancient bloody conflict out of the shadows and into our backyard. The rougarou was fighting to reclaim the borderland we had inadvertently occupied, and the grunch were the invading army. We weren't the targets anymore. We were just spectators to a war between monsters. The battle was a chaotic, brutal ballet of violence under the moonlight. The rougarou was taking wounds. I could see dark gashes on its arms and back where the grunch's claws had found their mark. But it gave far better than it got. For every wound it took, It left two of the pale creatures broken and twitching on the blood-soaked grass. It was magnificent and terrifying, a living embodiment of the swamp's most savage heart fighting for its home. And for a fleeting, insane moment, I found myself rooting for the monster. Watching the primal war rage in our backyard, a strange sense of detachment had come over me. It was like watching a brutal nature documentary, too surreal to be truly happening to us. But the illusion of safety was shattered in an instant. While the Rougarou was a whirlwind of fury, a one-man army holding the line against the swarm, he couldn't be everywhere at once. The Grunch were clever, pack hunters to the core. While the bulk of their forces were engaged in a losing battle with their ancient enemy, a splinter group had other ideas. We heard the sound from above us. A scraping, scrabbling noise on the roof, followed by a shower of soot and debris falling into the living room fireplace. "The chimney," Sean breathed, his face draining of all color. It was the one weakness we hadn't considered. An old, wide chimney flue, big enough for a man, or something man-sized, to crawl down. Before we could even react, a pale, spindly form dropped into the hearth with a soft thud, unfolding itself like a broken doll. It was followed immediately by another, and then a third. They were inside. The sanctuary of our home instantly became a claustrophobic death trap. The three Grunch creatures fanned out, their glowing eyes fixing on us in the dim light. They were smaller than the Rougarou, but wiry and fast, all sinew and bone and malice. The heavy, foul air of the Snake Ridge caves filled the room. The fight for survival was no longer outside our walls. It was here, in our living room. The first one lunged. It moved with a startling, sideways, scuttling motion, low to the ground. I brought the shotgun up and fired without thinking. The blast of buckshot hit it square in the chest at point-blank range, throwing it backward against the wall where it slid to the floor in a heap. One down. But the other two used the moment to split up, flanking us. "Sean, get back!" I yelled, racking the pump, the shuck-shuck sound loud in the enclosed space. One of the creatures scurried toward the kitchen, while the other darted behind a large armchair. The sounds of the battle outside, the roars and shrieks, were a distant, muffled backdrop to the immediate, heart-pounding terror of the enemies in our house. Sean, to his credit, didn't panic. He grabbed the small felling axe we'd been using for clearing brush, its handle short but its head heavy and sharp. He held it in front of him, his knuckles white. The Grunch that had gone into the kitchen suddenly reappeared in the doorway, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It let out a series of sharp clicks, and the one behind the armchair answered. They were coordinating. As if on a signal, they both charged. I aimed for the one coming from the kitchen, but it was incredibly fast, juking to the side as I fired. The shot went wide, blasting a chunk of plaster from the wall. The creature behind the armchair used my shot as its opening, leaping over the furniture with terrifying agility, its long claws outstretched toward Sean. There was no time to reload, no time to think. Sean swung the axe in a wide, desperate arc. The creature was faster than him, but it misjudged his reach. The head of the axe caught it in the side of its leg, biting deep. It let out a piercing, agonized shriek and stumbled, but its momentum carried it forward, crashing into Sean. The two of them went down in a tangle of limbs. I swung the heavy shotgun like a club, bringing the stock down hard on the head of the Grunch I had missed. The impact was solid, and the creature crumpled, stunned. But the one on top of Sean was thrashing wildly, its claws slashing at his arms and chest, its lipless mouth snapping just inches from his face. Sean was yelling, trying to push it off, his hands slipping on its slick, damp skin, I kicked the creature hard in the ribs, sending it rolling off my son. It recovered in an instant, turning its glowing eyes on me, its shriek turning into a hateful hiss. I fumbled to chamber another round, my hands shaking. The sounds from outside were fading, a sign that the larger battle was moving away or nearing its end. But our war was here, in this room. The creature lunged at me. I got the shot off just in time. The blast caught it mid-air, and the wall behind me was painted with its dark, viscous blood. Panting, I turned back to Sean. He was scrambling to his feet, bleeding from a long gash on his forearm, but otherwise okay. The third creature, the one I had clubbed, was beginning to stir. "The basement!" I yelled, grabbing Sean by his good arm. "Go!" There was no way we could fight another one, let alone a potential second wave. Our only chance was to find a place we could truly barricade. We half ran, half stumbled through the house, the sounds of the monster outside seeming to grow again. We threw open the heavy wooden door to the basement and scrambled down the dusty steps, the air growing cool and damp around us. The basement was the one part of the house that was built like a bunker, a remnant of a bygone era's fear of hurricanes. The door at the top of the stairs was thick oak, but more importantly, it had a heavy sliding iron bolt on the inside. I slammed the door shut just as a heavy body thudded against the other side. Sean and I threw our combined weight against the bolt, ramming it home into its iron bracket. We were safe, for now. Plunged into absolute darkness, we slumped to the foot of the stairs, listening. The sounds of fighting inside the house mixed with the roars and screams outside. We were trapped in our own cellar, prisoners in our own home, waiting to see which monster would win the war being waged just a few feet above our heads. The rest of the night was an agonizing exercise in listening. We sat in the cold, musty darkness of the basement, our backs against the unyielding stone foundation, flinching at every sound from the world above. The cacophony was terrifying. We heard the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floorboards, the splintering crash of furniture, the guttural roars of the rougarou, and the piercing death screams of the grunch. It sounded like a war zone, and for all we knew, it was. At some point, the sounds moved away from the house, back out into the yard, a running battle that faded and swelled with the tide of the fight. We were completely blind, armed with nothing but the terrifying soundtrack of the monster's war. Slowly, agonizingly, as the hours crawled by, the sounds began to change. The frantic, high-pitched shrieks of the grunch grew less frequent, more scattered. They were losing. The deep, furious roars of the rougarou became more dominant, a proclamation of victory across the blood-soaked battlefield of our property. Then, as the first faintest hint of gray began to lighten the sliver of space under the cellar door, a new quality entered the cries of the grunch. It was a sound of panic, a chittering retreat, and then silence. The silence that followed was as deep and profound as the one that had preceded the attack, but this time it felt different. It was the quiet of exhaustion, the stillness of the aftermath. We waited, barely daring to breathe, for what felt like another hour, until the gray light under the door had brightened to a pale, hopeful yellow. You think it's over?" Sean whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we can't stay down here forever." With trembling hands, I slid the heavy iron bolt back. The sound was deafening in the stillness. We pushed the door open and crept up the stairs, the shotgun held at the ready in my arms. The house was a complete wreck. It was a scene of utter devastation. The bookshelf lay in a splintered heap by the front door. The armchair in the living room was torn to shreds, its stuffing strewn across the floor like dirty snow. And everywhere, on the floors and the walls, were the dark, drying stains of blood. Both the thick, blackish ichor of the grunch and the brighter red of the rougarou. The bodies of the 3 grunch that had made it inside were still there, pale, twisted shapes that were already beginning to draw flies in the growing warmth of the morning. We stepped cautiously onto the veranda, and the scale of the carnage took our breath away. The lawn was a disaster zone. At least a dozen pale, broken bodies of the grunch were scattered across the grass and in the muddy bank by the water's edge. They had been torn, battered, and broken with savage fury. Our yard had been the epicenter of a massacre, and then we saw him. Near the edge of the cypress forest, his back to us, stood the rougarou. He was leaning heavily against a tree, his massive frame slumped with exhaustion. His dark fur was matted with blood, his own and that of his enemies. A deep gash ran along his flank, and one of his powerful shoulders drooped at an unnatural angle. He was grievously wounded, but he was alive. He was the victor. As we watched, he slowly, painfully pushed himself away from the tree. He turned his head, and for a long, heart-stopping moment, his burning red eyes met mine across the 100 feet of ravaged lawn. There was no rage in his gaze now, no savage fury. There was only a deep, weary intelligence. It was a look of shared experience, a silent acknowledgement from one defender to another. He had protected his home, and in doing so, had inadvertently protected ours. He held my gaze for a second longer, a silent, grim understanding passing between man and monster. Then, with a weary, limping gait, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the cypress swamp, leaving us alone amidst the carnage. Sean and I stood on the ruined porch, the rising sun casting long shadows across the field of dead monsters. We had survived, but the knowledge brought little comfort. Our home was destroyed, a shell of what it once was, stained with the violence of a conflict that had raged for centuries. We were alive, but we were still on the front lines. The grunch had been defeated but not exterminated. Their caves at Snake Ridge were still there, teeming with their kin, and now they had a reason to hate the inhabitants of this house. The rougarou, our unwilling protector, was wounded and had retreated into the depths of the bayou. The sun climbed higher, its warm rays feeling alien and out of place in the scene of devastation. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the foul stench of the dead grunch. We looked at the wreckage of our new life, at the quiet, waiting bayou and the dark, silent forest. The next night would come. The war wasn't over. We had just survived a single, brutal battle. We had a choice to make, standing there in the fragile light of a new dawn. We could run, abandon this cursed piece of land, and never look back. Or we could stay, clean our weapons, and fortify our walls, accepting our place as the reluctant wardens of this violent, ancient borderland we had tried to call home. Looking at the rising sun, I had no idea which choice was the right one, but I knew we had to make it soon. The darkness would be back before we knew it.